39% to the point of insanity. A warm wind moved his hair. The smells of a hot summer meadow hit his nose, and the sky, without a single cloud, hung over him like a huge blue lens. Ilya turned his head, looking out over an endless field of color. It was warm outside, but cold and damp inside. He wanted to take a step, but a thought from somewhere below knocked him off his feet. He woke up with a loud sigh, as if an invisible force had collapsed on his chest and pressed him to the bed. The cabin was dark. He could hear metal creaking off the ceiling. "Lena?" he whispered. But his wife did not reply. Ilya took out a cell phone from a pocket of his shirts and turned on the flashlight. A shivering beam of light cutting the gloom spotted a shabby drawer by the window and another single bed. In an instant there was a vicious silence, the air filled with coarse particles of damp dust set in motion by human breathing. The guy gazed in horror at the time-skewed ballard. The cheap board was swollen, its surface cracked, and the paint came off in flakes and bubbles. The sheets on the bed were mixed into a barely distinguishable pile of dirty rags and some crap, covered with either bits of rust that had crumbled from the ceiling of the cabin or some small rubbish. The guy rushed to the small window, wiping the wet dust off the cold glass with a trembling palm. Outside, darkness stared back at him. For a minute, he just stared at his reflection, illuminated by a flashlight, waiting for his breath to return to normal, or hoping that he might see some movement outside the window, maybe even a rescue diver. But as the seconds passed, nothing changed. He would have been frightened, truly frightened, if he could have realized what was happening. If he could have made some assessment of this old, time-worn cabin, if yesterday he had not seen the liner Adriana as new and shiny as a luxury car. Ilya got to his feet, which were trembling treacherously, and went to the door. Of course, he hesitated before opening it. He feared that at the moment the icy ocean water would gush in. Outside, to either side of the cabin, there was a grim corridor of rusted walls. The woodwork had long crumbled to dust, and the large paintings, adorning the room in some places, were broken, lying in shallow pools of water below. The lad stared down the corridor in the light of the flashlight, trying to see anything but a picture of a mad fate. He returned to the cabin after that, and the rusty mattress springs creaked miserably, taking on the weight of a human body. It became cold. Steam was coming out of his mouth. "There must be clothes somewhere here," said Ilya as if in a trance, and opened the door of a small locker, which immediately came off its hinges and fell to the floor with a loud pop. That sound, which immediately flew somewhere in the corridor and then even farther, made him scared. In his spare time, in that other, now seemingly unreal life, he would often visit abandoned objects of varying degrees of danger and knew the sacred rule of stalking. Whatever you do, try to stay inconspicuous. With his cold fingers, he took out his duffel bag, whose zipper broke open as soon as his hands touched it, and began to rummage through its contents. His favorite jeans grayed with time. The fabric was disintegrating into fibers, spreading the smell of decay and mustiness into the room. He had always carried a Swiss knife and a flashlight. He even went to work like that. But now he was standing in the middle of an abandoned cabin in beach shorts and a t-shirt, holding a cell phone with 49% of its charge left. With a quiet sigh, He set the bag down on the bed. With a modest but firm stride, fear worked its way into his mind. It seemed even his joints began to ache from the feeling of wild hopelessness. Ilya turned off all the services on his cell phone to save the battery. All the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, contacts and games instantly became the most useless invention of mankind. No matter what happened on the Adriana, he needed to get out as soon as possible. The economy staterooms were on the lowest deck. If you went one deck higher, you could get some air and look around, unless of course it is sunk. That's impossible, Ilya said quietly. There would have been water here by now. He looked around the cabin absently, gathering his thoughts, checking to see if he had forgotten anything. But there was nothing to forget. Even the plastic water bottle on the side table was cracked and leaking, and the plastic itself whitened with time. The guy left the cabin with uncertain steps, his flip-flops sinking immediately into the icy water. He walked slowly forward, illuminating the road not even with a flashlight, but with the display on. The sounds of his footsteps overtook him, echoing somewhere in the distance. There must be emergency stairs on both sides. Wherever I go, the path will take me to the top. Some rustling distracted him from his creative thoughts, and the guy lurched, listening. All his senses rose to the point where he seemed to be able to hear even with his skin. He was ankle-deep in water, but the sound of footsteps continued and grew louder. Ilya turned on the flashlight, shone it forward, and the beam of light pierced the void until it melted away altogether, finding no obstacle. 7 meters away, just at the border of light and darkness, the water shook with invisible footsteps. A step. Circles diverged in different directions. Another step, louder and closer. Without waiting for something to catch up with him, the guy ducked into the empty cabin and closed the door with a deafening creak. The invisible guest reached the door and stopped. Ilya could hardly hold his loud breath, which gave away his fear better than any other indicator. Cold sweat trickled down his back, instantly making his t-shirt wet. The cell phone light flickered around the cabin for a couple of minutes, stopping at the rusty door, until it finally faded off to plunge the room into an impenetrable darkness. In that thick, sticky, slimy darkness, there came a knock.
Ilya?
A voice asked from outside. "Lena?" He whispered, and he could hardly control his reflex to rush to the door and open it at once. It was not his wife. You can see your wife when she approaches. His wife would call him at once.
Baby, open the door.
The familiar voice demanded. Never has his wife called him baby. The man stood silently, clenching his teeth to the point of pain. "Ilya Vladimirovich, open up, it's the rescue team." Scared out of his ears, he was stepping back until his back rested against the corner of a bollard, cold and damp like everything else around.
Are you okay?
"Open up!" An inaudible whisper could be heard in the background of loud voices. With sweaty palms, the guy took out his phone and turned on the recorder to hear the background. It is difficult to say what made him do that, just as it is difficult to assess everything happening. Something kept banging on the door, and now several hands were drumming, and the sound of the banging was becoming unbearably loud. And despite this, despite the horror and doubt, there was a strange desire to open the door. It became irresistible. It drove me to the point of frenzy. Now the first step was taken, then the second. Maybe there really are rescuers out there. Maybe he would open the damn door and the warm light of the tropical sun would burst into the cabin, filling it with the serenity so forgotten in the last half hour. Maybe he'd just bumped his head, and that all was just his imagination. Ilya shook himself, stopping and starting the tape again. The recorder didn't catch the voices of his wife and rescuers. The speaker first gave out some static noise, and then the whispering of 100 people. Some of them spoke louder. You could make out some words.
Is he opening? He is now, yes, about to. Shh. He can hear. He can hear. He's about to. Almost. Shh. Quiet. Tasty. With us. With us.
The prickly goosebumps instantly spread across his skin. Fumbling on the edge of the bed, Ilya sank gently down on it, staring wide-eyed at the cell phone screen. The urge to open the door dissolved as suddenly as it came. About 10 minutes passed as he was turning the recording on again and again, keeping himself from opening the door to the unknown creature. Then everything went quiet. For a while the guy sat in the dark. He tried not to think about anything, tried to let his body and his brain rest. He had to get to the open deck. Nothing else mattered. Nothing else could be solved. Nothing could be solved now. It was time to go. Soon the hateful corridor appeared again before his eyes, and on the open door of the cabin there were smooth spots among the flakes of rust. There were the marks of someone's palms. Small and large, they covered the entire surface from the floor to the ceiling and went farther into the darkness. Whatever the creature was, or whatever the creatures were, it was better not to think about. Ilya went forward, tense as a string. He spotted open cabins along the way and turned around all the time, listening for the creak of the abandoned ship. Finally, the stairs. Silence. Never before had he been so glad of such a heavy silence, when he could only hear the sound of his own steps and his nervous breathing. On the second deck he hesitated. The corridor, resembling the previous one with a slight difference, greeted him with a murky emptiness. "Another one?" he asked in a trembling whisper. "Can it be a mistake?" It looked true, because he had only seen the liner once. Yesterday, when he and Lena, quite drunk, staggered through its corridors in search of maritime adventures. And at the same time, cruise liners had open decks on each floor. But not this one, not in this hell. The last thought stung him more painfully than a snake bite. His death would explain so many things. And that insane fear, and the wet cold, and the rusty walls. Only a cruel and prickly desire to leave rejected the theory. He would still struggle. The corridors are not endless. Unlike a phone battery, there came squelching noises from below. Wasting no second, the guy was at the open door in 2 leaps and flew into the cabin, slamming it shut behind him. The footsteps were getting closer. A terrifying whisper grew in his ears like the roar of a snow avalanche. Soon there was a knock on the door. Ilya's sensitive ears picked up sticky touches on the locked door, as if lots of wet hands were touching it, examining it, looking for any crack or crevice.
Darling, open up.
It's his wife again. Nothing new. Ilya Vladimirovich! The rescue team again. A lot of people crowded at the door. A lot of people came to save him. So many. Everyone is taking care of him. And what is he doing? Shivering like a wet mouse. The guy had already taken a step towards the door when suddenly he stopped, gathering all his will into a fist, and turned on the recorder. Now hundreds of voices spoke differently. They were predatory. In every word there was a sneer and a certainty that sooner or later the many-faced creature would get its coveted prey. It went on, and each time the unbearable desire to open the door intensified, scalding like cold ice, and disappeared with the width of the phone speakers. Ilya sank to the floor, with his back against the bed, and covered his ears with his hands. Through his fingers, he could hear his wife calling his name, hundreds of voices laughing at him, anticipating the inevitable end. The cell phone was counting down the percentage of the battery charge. Here it was, 40%, 39%, and the voices wouldn't stop. 39% to insanity. 38%. What happens if he opens the door? Maybe it's not so bad. Somewhere far, far away from here, in his hometown, he's quietly going crazy in a snow-white room, and the nurses are drumming on the door, which he closed by pulling his bed to it. So hungry, so cold. Oh, how much he would have given, not for this useless cell phone with the huge display, but for an old Nokia that could hold a charge for up to 3 days, and for a bowl of hot soup and a glass of vodka. I'm so tired, the guy whispered, curled up on the damp cold floor.
Well, open the door, kid.
Lena had never called him kid. Suddenly, he imagined himself opening the door and falling into her arms. A fireman with an axe, for some reason, standing nearby, grinning widely. The sun is shining. Here they are on another ship, and behind them, spewing puffs of smoke from huge pipes, like an ancient dragon, there's the defeated Adriana going down under the water. Once more, from the beginning of the tape, again and again, until the creature is gone. He pointed angrily at the screen with a cold finger. The voices grew louder. The banging on the door shattered the debris of the dilapidated walls, and the whole cacophony of sounds fell into one mess, along with the whizzing of the recorder, until finally it all went silent. How long did it last? Ilya threw a glance at the display. It took him almost half an hour to fight the damn things. Last time it was 10 minutes. How long would the next one be? Swaying on his legs, numb with cold, the guy staggered out into the dark corridor. He could tell of himself that in his past life he had been a sturdy man, and there were few things that could frighten him. In his past life? And what about this one? And in this life, the dilapidated walls were so tightly woven into his sanity that there seemed soon to be nothing left but these wet corridors and the deafening whisper of 1,000 voices. When the battery dies, he forbade himself to think. Sometimes you must do what you have to, or what feels right, or what you remain capable of. Ilya grabbed the rough railing of the staircase with his hands and dragged himself up. At times he thought of footsteps in the corridor below or right in front of him, but they dissolved immediately when he stopped and listened. Reality slowly warped, creating the illusion of fear around every corner. In that state, you lose track of time. It seemed like an eternity had passed. On the next floor, further down the corridor, huge panoramic windows were glittering with broken glass, and behind them, night reigned, clasping Adriana in a firm embrace. The guy stepped outside and turned off his cell phone. Soon his eyes would have to get used to the moonlight, and here, in the open, he wouldn't have to use a flashlight. Time passed, and the vision did not return. Absolute darkness, no light sources. Ilya turned his head, looked up, trying to see the light of the stars, but in vain. Very quickly he lost his orientation. He couldn't tell the top from the bottom. His exhausted body began to stagger. The light of the display brought back the sense of reality of the happening. The guy staggered forward, past the overturned chase lounges and the empty pool, towards the bow of the ship. He no longer knew what to do. The short mission was over, and nothing had happened. He was left to stand and wait, or simply exist. Darkness was coming in on all sides. Very quickly Ilya noticed that it was absorbing the light of the flashlight, thickening in the corners and crevices. He looked ahead at the peeling boards, and his back was in the dark. The temperature was dropping, and a thick, boiling steam was coming out of his mouth. Behind him, somewhere in the corridor, he heard the familiar footsteps of many feet. But Ilya didn't move. He didn't run. He was just standing with his back to the horror and listening. A shiver ran through his body. That moment, he stared into the ugly face of a terror that didn't even exist. Turning sharply, the guy watched wet footprints appear on the deck in front of him. A multitude of footprints, small and large. They covered the entire space, which the flashlight beam snatched out of the darkness. The footprints drew nearer, and there was the sound of slapping and the growling voices. The flashlight grew quite dim. It struggled to penetrate the darkness, and wherever the rays touched the wet patches, one could see tall, skinny creatures, their bony bodies covered with skin as clear and brittle as paper, equipped with long limbs and faces vaguely resembling those of men, were not afraid of the miserable flashlight. On the contrary, they raised their snouts to make their prey see their presence and feel the fear more clearly. Behind them, the pitch-black waves rustled. There is water there. Then there must be the shore. A man cannot be defeated if he has hope. And if there are bloody shores in this bloody world, he will find them, for he will swim forward as long as he can. The footsteps were getting closer. He could hear the slapping of hundreds of bare feet and the growing clamor of voices. The guy threw one last glance at his cell phone. 10%. He wouldn't wait for the madness. Making one last effort on himself, Ilya swung over the railing, hearing a disgruntled squeal behind him, and feeling someone's narrow palm slip around his ankle in a final attempt to grab the victim. The icy water engulfed his body without a sound, as if a balloon had burst in his head. His consciousness exploded with unbearable pain and faded. He woke up in the cool room, immediately sitting up on the bed. His chest ached and his head felt heavy, as if hot lead had been poured inside. Lena was sitting next to him. She put the book aside and put her arms around Ilya, gently pulling him close.
God!
Tears poured from her eyes.
Oh God, he's awake!
And then she mumbled something more, but the guy could not hear clearly. He softly pushed the girl away from him. It was all right. It was warm in here. It was dry. Then why was his heart pounding in his chest like crazy?
Shall I call for a nurse? Are you sick?
He shook his head vaguely. Something had happened and made him different forever. He tried hard, but the last thing he could remember was them going on the car on a long-planned cruise. Then a crash. They flew out into oncoming traffic. The couple never made it to the Adriana that day.